What you are seeing right now is the Samsung QN90B. It looks pretty good, doesn't it? And it really does in person. But I'm going to add in the LG C2 to compare as well and go over some differences. So if you saw my previous video, I'm actually very happy with the QN90B this year. I think it's a very notable improvement over the QN90A and is much more like an OLED this year than last year. However, there are still some areas where OLED is superior, and there's also one particular issue that really stands out for the QN90B that is kind of confusing. Compared to the QN85B, the step down model with the ADS panel, Tech with KG did a comparison and showed that it has more saturated color in HDR games than the QN90B. And the same is true when comparing it to an OLED like the C1 or C2. Now, what I've seen is the auto color gamut selection on the Samsung doesn't auto change anything. It just matches whatever gamut you have selected under custom. So I think that has something to do with it. However, the problem is with games, while P3 is the most common HDR color space, there are some games out there that take advantage of a little bit wider into BT 2020, and with the TV not making that change automatically, then either you oversaturate your colors by putting it into BT 2020, or you really blow them out by putting it into the native gamut. However, it's gaming, so for some people, they probably really won't care. And if you aren't using the native gamut, then the color saturation just doesn't match OLED or even the QN85B with its ADS panel, which ADS is very similar to IPS, and those panels do have better color than VA. Or actually, they're capable of better color. So now I'm actually showing it against the C2, going through the different color options here on both. And you can see when setting them comparably, the C2 just has more saturated HDR color. Now the QN90B, of course, is brighter. So both of these TVs are shot individually, very carefully, to try and capture them as best and most realistically as possible. Now, in gaming, the brightness advantage isn't as great as it is in movies. That has to do with the local dimming performance being reduced in game mode, and just the fact that most games are 1000 nits, so there's not enough headroom for it to really stretch. And also, both of these are set into their accurate modes, or at least as accurate as possible, because on the Samsung, it still does overtrack EOTF in game mode a little bit. But that said, if you look at this footage and compare the differences, whenever there's a really bright highlight spot, you can see the difference in the video. However, even the best cameras in the world, and I mean, I have one of the cameras with the most dynamic range possible, it still doesn't come anywhere close to capturing the full brightness. So wherever you see on the QN90B a bright spot that's clearly brighter than the C2, it's probably even brighter and more of a difference than what you can see here. It's just, that's the technology of cameras. So if I were to record them side by side, then the camera would, if exposed for the QN90B, would make the C2 look way darker and dimmer than it actually is. And then vice versa, if you expose for the C2, then the QN90B would be all blown out and you won't be able to see anything. So doing it this way, you can see the clear details for both, you can see the color for both, and you can also still see in the highlights where the Samsung is brighter. And on the other side, it also allows you to see into shadow areas better and see the shadow detail differences and the darkness of the OLEDs as well. So it's the most fair way to show both, but again, the QN90B highlights just cannot be captured when trying to retain all the detail. And I do want to reiterate that in gaming, the brightness difference is certainly there, certainly visible, but it is not nearly at the level that you see in movies, in movie mode. That's where it actually does use the full ability of the panel, and in game mode, it does seem to restrict some of its brightness because of that reduced local dimming performance, which also does affect its perceivable contrast and its performance in low light or dark areas. Also in SDR, where the brightness doesn't really matter because it's however bright you set it. But in SDR content, in game mode, that reduced local dimming does make a very noticeable difference against the OLED, again, in really dark areas. But now I need to counter everything I just said and also emphasize that in a vacuum, if you go and buy the QN90B, it's still amazing. It still really is really great. It is the best LCD to date that I have seen. It's probably still going to remain the best 4K LCD this year. We'll see what happens later, but that's what I'm guessing. And I think most people are still going to be perfectly fine with it. It's just the one real area that if you're a real stickler for HDR color saturation in games specifically, then you probably want to still look at OLED. You know, the LG C1, C2, G1, G2, the Sony's, whatever, or even the new QD OLEDs. They have that color in the HDR game mode, and again, the Samsung should be able to do that as well. It has that performance capability, but there's just something going on with its color gamut selection. Because if you put it to native, then it's just too crazy with the color, but it's certainly capable of it. And then if you try to calibrate it, the color management system in HDR doesn't work. So there's nothing really you can do about it. That said, Tech with KG really likes the QN85B as long as you're looking at it straight on. So maybe that's something you can look into if you really want to go with an LCD and your priority is games over movies. But that said, I think still most people are going to be absolutely happy with the QN90B regardless. I just wanted to point out that the OLEDs and even other LCDs do have advantage in color in HDR games specifically, whereas in SDR games, the difference is kind of still there, but so small you wouldn't notice it. It'd be hard to see even side by side. But in movies, again, not really a problem. Movies are in P3. You just leave it on auto or set it to P3, good to go. And then it just comes down to, do you want those like really bright highlights and really bright TV, or do you want the better handling near black and having, you know, better darker scenes in your movies that you get with an OLED? To me personally, I really, really like OLED, but the QN90B was so good in movies. You know, watching the new Spider-Man and stuff, it's just really is so good that if all I wanted was a TV for HDR movies, I would probably go with it. Even if that does mean playing the panel lottery multiple times to get a clean enough panel as far as DSE goes. But still, you probably have seen through some of this footage, the brightness difference, again, through most of the image really isn't that different, and that's because the C2 is in HGIG, follows EOTF pretty well. The QN90B does lift EOTF, but by setting the ST2084 setting to -3, it does really help that. It's still a little lifted, but not too much. So again, the real difference that you see is in the highlights. And again, just try to imagine the highlights on the QN90B even a little bit brighter than what's being captured. And this footage isn't going to be all games. I am going to run through the Spears and Munzel disc as well to show the difference there. But I really wanted to focus more on the gaming because that's where the really only kind of issue that I see with the QN90B when comparing them, where it is really noticeable. Whereas in movies and stuff, they're pretty close. Just again, QN90B gets up high a little more, and OLED still does better down low, but the QN90B has improved down low quite a bit. Also, I do kind of want to point out too that while you're watching this, you know, you hear all the time about how OLEDs look blue on camera. Well, shooting in this method, you can see how the white's pretty much the same on them. So that's another huge advantage for doing the comparison this way and properly shooting the TVs and putting them together. Aside from cropping the image and sitting them next to each other, no other changes are made to the footage. Nothing is color graded or adjusted, anything like that. It's literally just the straight footage put together, cropped, and set next to each other. That's it. So Kena Bridge of Spirits here. This is an actual SDR game. This is SDR game footage. I did max out the brightness on the OLED, and on the QN90B, I got close to that brightness, but obviously it can go way, way brighter in SDR. All right, so we're about to be coming up to the Spears and Munzel demo, and when I recorded that, I did it two ways on the C2. I did it in its accurate mode, and then I also did it in the where you turn on dynamic tone mapping and turn on the AI Picture Pro. The two of them together this year actually works pretty well. So when you turn on the dynamic tone mapping, it does lift your midtones, and then the AI Picture Pro analyzes the scene and looks for certain objects, areas that it can darken and others that it can brighten. So it kind of offsets that over brightened midtone look from dynamic tone mapping, but at the same time does allow the highlights to get brighter and the dark areas still look pretty correct. Now, I'm not sure how well that's going to measure, but I did want to show it both ways because I'm sure a lot of people, especially in a bright room, would want the dynamic tone mapping and AI Picture Pro on. Whereas if you're in a dark room and you want accuracy, you just leave both off. So I wanted to show both ways here compared to the QN90B. And let's reiterate one more time, QN90B, far, far brighter. The camera cannot capture its brightness even remotely close to how much brighter it is in very bright scenes like this. But then again, the camera also struggles capturing really dark, shadowy areas where OLED has advantages. So this is the most balanced and best way to show them. So, and the camera is set with the same shutter speed, and my camera has variable shutter, so you shouldn't see any flicker from the screens from capturing it on the camera. So that's always going to be the same. And the ISO, I always shoot in native ISO for the cleanest footage. And then white balance is done specifically to each panel. And then all the color settings and the picture profile option is always the same. The only thing that changes is the aperture, which is just the capturing the amount of light. So when you see it transition from a very dark scene to a very bright scene, it may take a second for the aperture to adjust and catch up to it. That has nothing to do with the TVs. That's just, again, the way it works when you try and do record a TV with a camera. Now, also on the LG, the brightness that it captures with the camera still doesn't capture as much as the LG puts out either. So that is a little bit brighter in person than what you're seeing. And also you got to take into account the display you're using. So I always recommend everyone watch this on the best display that you have. If you have a high-end newer phone or a MacBook or something, or if you have a nice TV, then watch it on that. And of course, listening to dialogue is the most important. So when it comes to calibration, the QN90B, I said earlier, the color management or CMS system doesn't work in HDR. So this is out of the box HDR color. And also right here, you can see the blooming from the Samsung. This is like a torture test in real content that is extremely rare to see. And as for the LG C2, it's not calibrated at all. It's actually not even supported yet in Calman. On the bottom, dynamic tone mapping off, that's just using the cinema picture preset at warm 50. And then with the top one, that's just turning on the dynamic tone mapping and the AI Picture Pro just to show those differences. However, once that support is added, you can definitely expect more accuracy out of the LG than you can the Samsung, especially in HDR. And then the LG also has Dolby Vision with Dolby Vision IQ and Dolby Vision IQ with Precision, which basically means what I described earlier, that it can examine each frame, and LG says they break it up into 2,000 zones that it can look at, and then darken some areas, brighten others. And from what I can see, what I believe, the dynamic tone mapping plus AI Picture Pro in HDR10 does the same thing. They probably just didn't market it that way because they just have marketing deals with Dolby Vision and so on. But it does seem that that mechanic or algorithm or whatever does work in HDR as well when you do this. Obviously, that's not like a confirmation or anything. The only way we would get that is probably from like an LG engineer or something who's not going to say anything about it probably. But it visually looks like that's what's happening. And like I hope you can see through this footage that the difference between the top and the bottom one on the C2 really just seems to be that the highlights are getting brighter and like the midtones are not raised. Like it looks accurate like the bottom one, which aside from a little bit of near black crushing does follow EOTF. And that little bit of near black crushing will brighten up over time a little bit, and with the proper calibration will be fixable and everything. So that's a different story. But also when you do turn on dynamic tone mapping and AI Picture Pro, it does help those shadow areas as well show that little bit more shadow detail that it is crushing with that off. So it's really hard to say right now if it's accurate, because I think given patterns to measure, it probably will not know how to react to that and probably will measure poorly. But what I can say is seeing it in real content, even next to my C1 calibrated, it looks really good and really close, to the point that, especially during daytime and bright room, I would suggest that you turn it on and try it. And being that I am a calibrator, this is one of those things where there's misconceptions about how calibration works. You can still get the C2 or G2 calibrated, get the white point right, the colors more accurate, do all of that, get your foundation to the image correct. Then you can turn these features on, take advantage of them, and make them even better. All right, so that's pretty much going to be it. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about using these features or not, or the C2 versus the QN90B or anything else. And I'm going to be gone a few days, but when I come back, I will have more videos for the C2, QN90B, and more TVs as well. So if you aren't subscribed, go ahead and hit subscribe. And I hope you all have a great one, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.